Good evening. Welcome to this, the last lecture in the series Knowledge in the Making Towards an Intellectual History of Early Modern Malta, a collaboration which has been going on since November, a series of lectures between the National Library and our Department of Philosophy at the university. It's a pleasure to be bringing the series to a close with a lecture by Professor William Zammit. I'm sure that he needs no introduction. Professor Zammit is a historian, one of the pioneers in the study of archives in Malta, a connoisseur. So it makes it sound a bit too amateur, so it's more than a connoisseur of this very place, of the National Library, its holdings and its archives, who has published extensively on various aspects of Malta's history, including, not only of course, but including book circulation, the history of the book, the history of archives and libraries, which fits very nicely with the theme of the series on intellectual history, because intellectual history also involves primarily the study of the transmission and the reception of knowledge. And as we have seen throughout this series, the transfer of knowledge happens through the movement of people, of ideas, of artifacts, and of course of books. And even though we might think that publishing books and expressing one's ideas in print form nowadays is fairly easy because censorship is limited, let's not say that it's completely, that we've completely abandoned censorship. But compared to the early modern period, right, censorship plays less of a role. Whereas when we're looking at the early modern period, and especially certain places, so the intellectual geography comes into it a lot, especially in certain places, various forms of censorship impacted how ideas and how knowledge is transferred and how knowledge circulates. And that's why I said that the title and the lecture will be assisting for today really fits into, it's another sort of piece of this puzzle which the series has not in any way completed, but which has opened spaces for more research and also for more of an integrated, let's say, approach to this aspect of Malta's history. So without any further ado, I'll pass on the microphone to Professor Zammit. As usual, afterwards we'll have time for questions.
Thanks very much, Jean-Paul, for that rather flattering introduction. Thank you all for being here. I will mainly be concentrating, obviously, on the prohibited material, the prohibited books that quite a number of them are actually looking at us from these August shelves up here. However, I think it's also important to give the context. So allow me to go a bit outside the strict perimeters of prohibited literature within this library for, I think, a better understanding of the whole scenario. Okay, I've put this August figure here. I mean, Grandmaster Emmanuel de Rohan, the penultimate Grandmaster in Malta, who was responsible for the official foundation of what was known during the time of the Knights as the Bibliotheca Publica, the public library. And again, I think it's important to explain that this Bibliotheca Publica was really publica in the sense that it wasn't a library specifically restricted to members of the order, to the Knights of St. John, but to everyone. We have references of Maltese making use of this collection. So it was publica in the real sense of the word. So, like quite a number of things, you get different birthdays, so to speak. So we get 1760, when Bettensen united his collection with that of Portocarrero. But officially, the official foundation of this library as part of the state of Malta, as part of the administration of Malta, goes to 1776 with the edict of Grandmaster de Rohan. Grandmaster de Rohan was a typical man of the time, and a reasonably enlightened individual who dealt in learning. He had his own library, some of his own personal books ended up here, useful bindings, etc. So that's me justifying that guy staring at us over there. Okay. This will be the first set of slides. So our library, the biblioteca, I love this term biblioteca. It gives a certain, a certain flavor, a certain romance to this place. One of the interests, it's not a terribly big national library, I mean collection-wise, space-wise. However, the collection is extremely interesting because it's multinational. By and large, I mean by their very definition, a national library primarily collects national literature. So you have legal deposit, so publications which are published in Malta have to enter this place, newspapers, everything, okay? And that's the primary remit of any national library. In this case, given the historical foundation and development of this collection, a very sizable, the staff here might correct me on this, but I venture to say 50%, if not more, of this collection here has absolutely nothing to do about Malta. All these books that surround us here, I would say a tiny, tiny fraction of them are what we refer to as militancia, books about Malta. So why are they here? Most of these books belonged to members of the order because of the regulation that when a knight died, his books were not to be sold, but were to come here and form part of this collection. So we're talking, obviously, it is our national library, but its importance and its value goes well beyond that. I mean, if I were to say, listen, if there was to be a European Union national library which should qualify as really a European Union library, I think our National Library would stand quite a good chance in that respect. Okay, so a very early 19th century image of this building. Again, I always say that this is one of the most conservative government departments. Nowadays it's not a department, it's an agency, but whatever, an agency, an entity, which has changed very little. And perhaps, you know, sometimes it's good to have it that way. I mean, there isn't even the statue of Grandmaster Valletta as yet. So the statue is still in Fort Manuel, let alone Queen Victoria's statue. So there you are, the building is essentially as it looks, the facade, essentially as it is to this day. The last civic building to be constructed by the order in Malta. We're talking 1790s. Again, I will be talking about the collection from 1760 to 1798. I will be talking at a time when the collection was not in this building. The collection came in this building in 1812. The building remained vacant. It was used as an officers' club, whatever, under the French, under the early British rule. Books were transferred only in 1812. So all that I'm going to say did not take place in this building, but the books were transferred here at a later stage. I mean, this is the sort of illustration that I imagine many of you would have seen, would have been familiar with. I doubt it whether you have ever seen this one, though. There are obvious elements that can be recognized there. There is the balcony of the Magistral Palace. So, one of our favorite areas where to have a good coffee and, you know, something nice and sweet. Republic Square nowadays. Queen Square, Piazza dei Cavalieri in those times, Queen Square, Republic Square. And on the right side, which is what should really interest us for this lecture, is, as far as I know, the only image of the building that stood on this site before the construction of the present edifice. That plain-looking building was known as the Conservatoria, and the order used it actually to conserve, to put the material. When members of the order died, their movable possessions were taken there, eventually to be sold off, whether it's furniture, whether it's silverware, whether it's books, everything eventually was to be sold. And even in our context, this is important, because this was one of the ways, definitely before 1776, how books circulated in Malta. Because you had members of the order having their own collections, having their own libraries. These books would end up there, and eventually you would have public auctions. And Maltese, other knights, Maltese, whoever, could buy these books. So that is something worth keeping in mind. Anyhow, that is the old plain conservatoria that was pulled down to make place for the present building that we can enjoy to this day, and hopefully to many more years. Okay, the collection. I mean, I will not delve a lot into this because much of this I'm sure you would be familiar with. 1760, I mean, this was happening everywhere in Europe. You have the Age of Enlightenment, you have the rich, the wealthy, the influential, who amass big collections and big libraries, and very often they decide, listen, I don't want my collection to be sold after my death. I want to set up some sort of public institution. Okay? Most of the old European national libraries were set up, either they were the old royal collections, like in the case of France, for example. Again, in Britain you get an amalgam, King George III collection, but also a number of important private collections that were donated. So in this case you have the Tansen bicycle collection. Incidentally, that guy there is not the Tansen, that's another guy, but Portocarrero is, a copy of the portrait is over there. The collections are combined after Portocarrero's death. The Tansen actually bought Portocarrero's collection because otherwise it would have been sold by the order. He unites them into one collection. He gets the Portocarrero books in Malta because Portocarrero lived in Rome. And you start getting the nucleus of this public library. The Tansen also agrees with the order that this will become the order's public library. He dies in 1766. Eventually, 1776, you have the official setting up of the library. Another very important thing is the Tansen employs the Gazettin Agius de Soldanis as the first librarian of this collection. So you have this Maltese, Gazettin, I'll better play safe here, this Gazettin, who is the first, and he did a lot of important work. We still have the original catalogues of the Soldanis, I might be able to refer to this. Anyhow, the collection is rapidly expanding. You get other donations, you get material that is entering the collection. Definitely from 1776 onwards, all the books belonging to a member of the order who passes away have to come to the library, even, and a good number of them actually died abroad. A French knight who is actually in France, his books are in France. Those books had to be brought over to Malta. They enter the collection. The Soldanis will go through those books. Any duplicates will be removed. The worst copy will be removed and eventually sold. So the selling aspect, to which I've already referred, remained in place. However, this time only duplicates will be, and we actually have, I've came across descriptions of these sales going on. So in the main hall of the old library, not here, you get days of sales, and you get descriptions of people going there, avidly going through the books and buying these second copies of these books. So that is what we are seeing here. Actually, this is how this collection came about. Okay, I've already referred to that. So yes, you get a lot of travelers to Malta, late 18th century especially. They comment about every aspect, from Maltese costumes to Maltese, to important places, etc. And every now and then you get this remark: there is such a lack of textbooks, of bookshops on the island. And it's true. I mean, very, very, very little is known about the presence of bookshops, of actual bookshops in 18th century Malta, which strengthens the importance of this. So you still have books. Books are entering the island, mostly from members of the order, but not just, because Malta was a very cosmopolitan society. I will come to that later on. So you have an influx. Even Maltese went abroad, bought books, got them over to Malta. Maltese went abroad before 1756, before printing in Malta. Maltese went abroad, they published their works abroad and brought their copies to Malta. So you had this thing going on all the time. Right, early characteristics of this biblioteca pubblika. Again, very characteristic of other proto-national libraries, other royal collections of the time, other important big private collections in Europe, some of which will eventually become public collections, the national collections. They were considered as sort of temples of knowledge. So it wasn't just books. Libraries housed anything that could be considered of having learning potential, learning characteristics. So libraries were also museums. The distinction between a library and a museum came later. In Malta, as late as 1903. Up till 1903, the museum collection was housed in this place. Okay? So, even in time of the night, and actually I've just worked on a paper on this, a museum collection that was housed in the library in the time of the night. So archaeological artifacts, curiosities, natural history material, you name it, it formed part of that collection. Yes, again, we're talking second half of the 18th century. You had the Knights of St. John. Many of them came from, not all of them, mind you, but a good number of them had a solid cultural background. They are interested in what's going on. It's the age of science, the age of enlightenment, what have you. And you have certain interesting things going on. For example, the setting up of a scientific observatory just across the road here in the Grand Master's Palace. The palace turret had been transformed into an astronomical observatory. Again, in the time of Rohan. So you had these interesting scientific snippets. This is something else. 1783, you get, the spectacular Montgolfier event in Paris. The first successful experiment with balloons. And ballooning becomes a craze throughout Europe. You might perhaps be surprised that this craze even reached Malta. And actually I came across a couple of experiments conducted here in Valletta with ballooning. So we have these two Italian knights. They've constructed this balloon, this aerostatic globe, in the courtyard of the palace here. Grand Master, all the big heads. We have a description of the balloon, constructed of paper, irregular shape, two pyramids. I mean, this is interesting because you come across this sort of construction illustrated in engravings, in books, on porcelain. It was a huge craze. And you get exactly this sort of, this type of balloon which was being produced. A circumference, 60 feet, 40 feet high. The globe remained in the air for about 21 minutes, and due to lack of wind, they must have been damn unlucky, these people. I mean, Malta is always windy, so traveled for just over half a league. Sparse wind, blowing from the southeast, resulting globe ending up in the sea. But notwithstanding its size, the contraption was refilled and took off with a starting point in under 4 minutes. So, the library and interesting prohibited literature on the island exists in this reality. Not in the area, don't go with the area that the knights were sitting down saying their rosary. Things are changing, even in such a small context. Okay, so let's start going more into our specific area, the users. I've already referred, Maltese society, I think since the last 500 years at least, even more, was always cosmopolitan. Okay, by the second half of the 18th century, most definitely so. So you get, these contacts with Europe, etc., all the time. I'm starting with the members of the order. So you have hundreds of knights residing in Malta, more or less on a permanent basis. Knights would come to Malta, they would go visit their home, they would come back to Malta. Some of them rarely traveled, so you get this thing going on. But you're talking about an important community of a few hundreds who are, they are getting to Malta, their ideas, their perceptions, their views, the books that interest them, the ideas that they are, getting from this material. This is quite early here. We're not 18th century here. We are first decades of the 17th century. One of the more interesting Grand Masters, Antoine de Paul, French. You all know that Antoine de Paul built St. Antoine Palace. Kind historians say he built it for his rest and, to get away from the stench of Valletta and what have you. There were other reasons as well. He had his lover there, whatever. This is Inquisitor Alfieri. You had the Inquisition in Malta, of course, and one of the responsibilities of the Inquisition was to guard precisely against prohibited literature. Now, prohibited literature could come in different forms. You can have a highly complex and detailed philosophical theological treatise, which is prohibited. You can have downright pornography, which is prohibited. And you got everything in Malta, the whole spectrum. We have evidence for the whole spectrum in Malta. So, Alfieri is informing Rome. Secret sources, they had there, that the Grand Master has lately received from Venice, now that's some networking, he knows what the Grand Master has received, my goodness. From Venice, 2 printed sheets entitled His Holiness Pope Urban VIII, but which then depict the 4 virgins. So we're talking about something anti-papal here, something, most probably bordering on pornography. Upon taking up the matter with the Grand Master's secretary, the latter informed me that he was about to hand them over to me. On the Grand Master's own instruction, so sort of, the postman sort of made a mistake apparently and he sent them to drunkenness. I have made it clear to him that any other similar material was also to be passed over to me without delay. Upon your orders from Rome, I am presently trying to trace the culprits who were responsible for the production and dispatch of such obscenities over to Malta. This is the Grand Master. This is not some lowly, some desperate knight or this is the reality of the situation. And again, we are lucky in Malta because of the richness of our archival material. We have a very complete archive of the Inquisition in Malta, which is then balanced by the original letters that the Inquisitors sent to Rome. This, for example, is in Rome. This is the original letter that Inquisitor Alfieri is sending to his superiors to Rome. So, that's how, you have to realize that this is a hidden subject by its very nature. These people who lived 300 years ago, they didn't exactly go out in the street, trumpeting the fact that they read prohibited literature. So even 300 years ago, it was secretive. Trying to borrow and trying to discover the sins of people who lived 300 years ago, we need, and the Archive of the Inquisition is certainly very important in this respect, anyhow. This is, I've put here just as an example, you had a lot of these anti-Catholic, anti-papal visual imagery being produced in Protestant countries, in countries like England, but not just. This is one such example. And it is also interesting, for example, when a new inquisitor came to Malta, every 5 years, 6 years, 3 years, they varied. He would be given a series of instructions from Rome. And these instructions hardly ever varied, really. One of the instructions that practically you always find it down to the very last. Be very careful, because Protestants use the Maltese harbour and they disseminate literature which is pernicious, which is perverse, which is anti-Catholic, so use extra care in that respect. So there was always this, and yes, especially in the 18th century, the British fleet used the Maltese harbour very regularly. So you did get this even if it's in English, if it's an image, the image, you know, a picture speaks 1,000 words. You don't need to understand English. In Malta, you know, hardly anyone knew English those days. However, the illustration is there. So a pile of sins, the Pope's pyramid, a pyramid of sins, you know, that was the responsibility of the popes. Okay. What do we have here? Number of cases. We're talking about members of the order. I don't like using the word knights. I prefer members of the order. Why? Because the Order of St. John didn't just include knights, it included priests. There were Maltese priests who were members of the order. Okay? So in a case like this, we're talking about the whole, whether knights, whether conventual chaplains, whatever they are, so long as they are members of the order. So by decade, by nationality, cases which were brought to the attention of the Inquisitor and which related to prohibited literature. Okay, I will not delve long on this, but I mean, just to give you an idea, we're talking about 90 years, and rightly so, we say, you know, the number is very significant. You're talking about 19 cases. Yes, which is very, very, very significant. However, one has to keep in mind certain things. First of all, we're talking 18th century, when, you know, I mean, something like reading Voltaire was prohibited, but sort of the Inquisitor, and we're talking about knights, and the Inquisitor might say, listen, I don't want to end up in a quarrel, you know, about a French knight who has a copy of Voltaire. So, but I mean, this is, what is more interesting, more than the actual figures, although the figures are indicative, is the actual case. So what are we talking about here? What were these books? We have them, I mean, you know, in the processi, in the paperwork, and you will get the details. And how did the book end up in your possession? Whether you actually read it or not, you know, you have the whole story in there. But I mean, this just gives us an idea about the situation. Okay, other non-Maltese. So these are non-members of the order, but also non-Maltese. And again, roughly we are in the same situation. The vast majority are Italians. Of course, the vast majority of non-Maltese in Malta would be Italians, so there you are. French, one case of an English person, one case unidentified, the nationality of the individual is not given. So you have this situation. So again, the tendency is sort of increasing. The numbers are, but only marginally. One can't really draw any conclusions from it, but marginally increasing towards. But again, this is rather superficial in the sense that you get references, these people are interrogated, and these people would say, listen, I'm the unlucky one. I've talked to scores of people in Malta who have prohibited books, but they were never reported. So this is really, we're talking the tip of the iceberg here. Right, Maltese. We also read prohibited literature. I've organized this by locality. So Valletta, Sejla, Vittoria, Brickikar, Cospicua, mostly we're talking about the harbor urban area of Malta, where you get the people who could read, where you get the people who could afford books, actually. So 30, roughly double the number of cases pertaining to the Knights, double the number of cases pertaining to non-Maltese. But again, one can explain that the population of Maltese was far, far larger than the Knights and the non-Maltese. So, but this is the important source. And it's important for research to be related in the sense that, I mean, this is material from the Inquisition. A good number of the books that were reported here are to be found here. So you get this relation going on. Okay, let's now pass over to the actual prohibited material in this collection. What can be studied? The two original collections themselves contained prohibited literature. Now, you might very, very reasonably sort of query, how come a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church actually hold prohibited literature? How come a Knight of the Order hold prohibited literature? Of course they did. They were cultured people. And you also had a system, and it's important to refer to this, you know, I mean, for every law, there is some way how to circumvert that law. And even when it came to prohibited literature, there was a way out. You could apply for a license. So you would apply to the local bishop, or else directly to Rome, it depends, you know, who you are actually. And very often, unless something is, you know, exceptionally unusual, you would be given a license to possess, to hold, and to read prohibited literature. In most cases, you were requested to actually specify the work that, or works that you would want to have. So there was, and the license was given for a number of years, usually 3 years or 5 years. Then you can reapply, sort of. It's like, I don't know, like MAP or whatever it is nowadays. So anyhow, so you had, I have found hundreds of these members of the order, the Maltese themselves. So in that case, and again, it's important also to say that the public library itself had this license. So when the public library was set up, and it had the prohibited material, and prohibited material continued to enter through the donations, etc., the library had a sort of a general permission to retain that material on condition that it cannot make it available to people who cannot read it, to people who don't have the license to read Voltaire, whatever, okay? Because otherwise it would have all been destroyed. We have the original library catalogues, and that's very important, very, very, very important. Why? Because, I mean, you know, you have no library in the world that has all the books that it originally had. Books get lost, books get destroyed, books get whatever. But the fact that we have the original catalogues, we can actually find out what actually had entered this collection. So they were the work of the Soldanis. Besides the original catalogues of the 10th century Porto Carrera, we have those as well. But there are the huge volumes of the Soldanis. So studying these catalogues has revealed, you know, a good number of prohibited works, some of which are still part of this collection, some of which have been lost over time. Okay, so the original catalogs, which we still have, the surviving catalogs, these are Soldanis catalogs. Some years ago, about 12 years ago, something like that, I had come across a manuscript description written by the Soldanis about his work in setting up the library. The original is not in Malta, the original is in Palermo, Biblioteca Comunale di Palermo. Probably he sent it to some friend, you know, these had contacts, these people had friends. He sent it over there. Now we have a copy in Malta, and it is extremely important, because the Soldanis actually explains the procedure, his work in the library. So the books were coming in, the process of selection, the way he is cataloging the collection, what is being sold, what is being kept, the issue of prohibited material. I mean, we know it from the Soldanis that the library had a sort of a general permission that they can keep, you know, the prohibited material. So we know quite a lot during these early years thanks to this write-up. We also have the catalogs, so from the aspect of sources, certainly we are quite lucky. So, prohibited literature in the Biblioteca. Where did this material come from? We had three main sources actually. Knights and others holding the required license, so they would have books in a perfectly legitimate way, at least for the duration of the license. One suspects much more members of the order who didn't care about license and whatever, and who had prohibited material. And the Biblioteca, that has its own license. So it can perfectly keep this material wherever it comes from, okay? So this material eventually will end up in the collection. I've referred to this actually. Information about here is balanced by what we know from the archive of the Inquisition. So, what do we have here? I mean, this is a subject that has been studied, it's being studied in the last 30 years, whatever. The presence of prohibited literature, its production, its dissemination, its readership, its impact, you know, all of that. I've took this table from one of the great pioneering works, Robert Darnton, Forbidden Bestsellers in Pre-Revolutionary France. And one of the many things that Darnton did was, I mean, you know, that must have taken him months and months of work just to do that table. The 10 best-selling prohibited books in France. In France before the revolution, because there, I mean, everything changes. So, you have the title, you have the author, number of copies known to have been sold through booksellers' records, what have you, orders, supplies for booksellers, number of editions, and then the sources that he uses. My humble part in all this is the very last column. What I did was, I used Darnton's table to apply it for here, okay? So, the first two, the most popular two prohibited bestsellers in pre-revolutionary France are present in this collection. I will be talking about those books because they are particularly interesting and important. So, out of 35 texts, I mean, the table continues. 15 were available in the order's library. You're talking just under 50%, which are confirmed to have been in the collection. One cannot exclude the possibility of others that were unrecorded, whatever. But at least close to half of this highly popular, these are the bestsellers of the Saucy literature, of the prohibited literature, were available in this collection. Again, these are taken from Darton as well. This is by author. Out of 23 authors, prohibited authors, 19 were available in the Order's library. I mean, by prohibited authors, it doesn't necessarily mean that all their works were prohibited, but these were authors who contributed rather substantially to the prohibited literature that was available. So over 80% of these authors were represented in this collection. Okay, let's go more specifically into these, at least some of them. Of course, I mean, just we would have to sleep here if we were to, but we're not going to do that. This is a beautiful, remember, this tops the list. This is number one. The Year by Mercier, okay? This is a futuristic book. Nouvelle Edition, there are a number of editions of this book. It was published anonymously. We know that the author was nowadays a totally forgotten, unknown name, Louis Sébastien Mercier. Again, very often we think that, the great names who published prohibited material, Voltaire, Rousseau, yes, of course, they did publish, but very often the popularizers of their ideas were others. So these were the people who read, who were well versed in the ideas of the great names, but who went further, who very often popularized such ideas, and Mercier certainly tops the list here. What is this book about? What made it so bad? It's a sort of a science fiction sort of book. So you have this guy, this French guy, who went to sleep, and he woke up. His problem was that he woke up 700 years later instead of 7 hours later. He woke up 700 years later, and he started going around the streets of Paris, meeting strange people, seeing strange things, seeing strange buildings, wondering whatever is going on, until finally he realized that something is terribly wrong. And the people he meets stare at him, and they tell him how weird you look. You have lace here, you have those culottes, you have something is not on. So eventually it transpires that he overslept. And now he becomes interested in France of the future, because, he's there actually now. Interestingly, before I pass to the next slide, this copy here, the library copy, has an ex libris, and those ex libris are very, very important. The name of a French knight, Chevalier Bougon, Regiment d'Aquitaine, 1st August 1774. The book was published in 1774. That alone is a false place of imprint. That's false. That book was printed somewhere in France. Okay, but better judgment prevailed, and they said, let's invent. You get these, sometimes you get pornographic books bearing the imprint in one of the rooms of the Vatican. I mean, they were highly imaginative in these. That alone is totally fake. Okay, but the date isn't. And this knight had this copy immediately upon the publication of this edition. And, he didn't even try to hide or something. He just wrote his name on the book. When eventually the book entered in this collection, we come here 260 years later, however, and we know that this guy actually had this prohibited book in his possession. Okay, so I mean, what was so bad about a book like this? Again, in this case, the problem is not the church, because it's important to clear this. Very often we think that the church prohibited books. The church published the index of prohibited books, and books which the church didn't like were put on the index. Yes, of course, that happened. And the index kept growing thicker and thicker and thicker. But it wasn't only the church that banned books. Governments banned books. In this case, prohibition is coming from the state, not from the church. Okay? So this poor, totally disoriented guy in the middle of Paris, 700 years after his birth, finally, might I ask you, what is the present form of your government? Is it monarchical, democratic, or aristocratic? Those were the three main forms of governments that 18th century people sort of were familiar with. And he gets his answer. It is neither monarchical, nor democratic, nor aristocratic. It is reasonable and adapted to mankind. You can notice that, 18th century people weren't exactly sure yet we're not even sure nowadays. What's the best form? What's the fairest form of governing? It is a reasonable government. A reasonable government. And adapted to mankind. The monarchy no longer exists. In some later editions, you have absolute monarchy no longer exists. But this is an early edition. The monarchy no longer, a sweeping statement like that, a more scathing statement like that, you can hardly get. Monarchical states always said to be swallowed up in despotism, just as rivers tend to be lost in the vastness of the sea, and the despotism soon collapses in upon itself. It is shameful to think that mankind has been able to measure the distance from the earth to the sun and weight the solar system, that having acquired this great knowledge, it has been unable to invent simple and effective laws for governing reasonable beings. That was certainly a statement which would have condemned this book to prohibition. Now, again, the fact that it is science fiction, it is not, complex philosophical argumentation. You have a story, a science fiction story. Those sort of books were very, very appealing, and no wonder that these were actually the best sellers, rather than, the heavy treatises about the best form of government. He's saying the same thing here, really, but in a way that... So that's Mercier. We have more than one edition here, huh? And that's one of the early ones. This is another example of state prohibition. The church really, the church sometimes, it depends on the country, whatever, sometimes it would follow suit. So if the King of France says, listen, I want this book off the face of the earth, the church sometimes would, they had their own congregation of the index, whatever, they might or they might not follow suit. This is, again, another case of state censorship. Anecdotes, sort of, listen, even the title, what is going to be said here? I cannot confirm it, but it's what people say, it's hearsay, it's anecdotes, about Mademoiselle la Comtesse du Barry. Mademoiselle la Comtesse du Barry was one of the mistresses, the last mistress actually out of a series, of King Louis XV of France, who was, a great womanizer. So, you get this book, again, published anonymously. We know who the author was, and someone, probably centuries ago also knew, and he wrote his name there, Parpida Sant de Mariobert, who was the author. And you get this book about what people say about Mademoiselle La Comtesse du Barry, who was even worse than her predecessors, because someone like Madame de Pompadour, who was a previous mistress of the king, at least came from noble lineage. She was cultured. You find her paintings, reading books. She was a patron of the arts. This one was, a sort of a gutter person, and so the scandal was even sort of, there was a lot to write on Mademoiselle du Barry. Again, à Londres, totally false. And you get the date 1775. The king had died just the year before, and the king had died actually through a disease transmitted by du Barry. We don't get the full ex libris name here, but we do get a coat of arms which is evidently pertaining to a member of the order. You get the 8-pointed cross and the background, so it's definitely a knight of the order there. And again, you might recall this one was again very popular, one of the top, the second writing in Darton's list. Okay, and you have a whole book there. I just took this small excerpt here, the description of the king. So it's not simply du Barry. This book impinges upon royalty, the sacrality. The king is God's anointed, God's represented on earth. Advancing age and the ease with which any great prince can satisfy his every desire had dulled his pleasure in matters sexual. Sort of at long last, he's sort of calming down. But this need, though diminished, still continued to exist. His doctors, and you get this irony here, yeah? His doctors had assured him that it was dangerous to wean himself too abruptly from a pleasure fundamental to his existence. So take it easy. Take it easy the wrong way. The monarch must have taken their advice to heart, as he charged the Sieur Lebel with the task of procurement in this area. And apparently, Sieur Lebel did his job well, and he pushed forward this Mademoiselle du Barry, who became the new mistress of Louis XV. Louis XV died 1774. Mademoiselle du Barry didn't die like the king peacefully in her bed. Du Barry was executed during the French Revolution as the mistress of the king. So again, this has nothing to do with the church here. This idea that the church, of course the church prohibited books, but states prohibited literature like the church did. These are some important examples. These books topped the lists of prohibited literature in France in terms of popularity. These books also entered this collection. Another Mercier, again anonymous, Tableau de Paris. This is mostly a descriptive book. This is describing the poverty, the destitution of the common people living in Paris in the last years of the Ancien regime. So you get this stuff, again, anonymous. In this case, you do get the names of the publishers in two different places, definitely not in France, in areas considered relatively safe, especially Neuchâtel. Neuchâtel was an important center for the printing of borderline prohibited literature that would end up in trouble. Not simply publishing, but also they had an important network how these books would circulate and be distributed throughout Europe. Again, you get an ex libris mark there. In this case, it's not manuscript, it's a printed label on the top with a Latin quotation there, and at some point, the name of the owner was covered. It might have been the owner himself, who at some point thought better than, leave his name there. It might have been done when the book entered this collection, but whatever the case, you get this ex libris, in this case with the name prudently concealed. Okay, we have been talking a lot about French literature. Of course, you get a lot of French literature in this collection, Italian literature, Spanish literature. Interesting, because you also get, a modest but respectable collection of English literature, very often in translation, obviously, because, of course, no one in Malta knew English. So you get these authors who are all represented very often in translation in the 18th century collection of the library. So we have different titles, number of English editions here, number of French editions, Italian editions, and in any other language. Those are all books that were available in this collection. One such example, Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe in French translation. A 1761 edition, translated in French, of Robinson Crusoe, which is available in this collection. John Dodsworth. John Dodsworth was the British consul in Malta during this time, middle of the 18th century. He wasn't apparently the easiest character to work with during his term in Malta. You had the 7 Years' War going on, which, complicated matters for the order, for Pinto, etc. in Malta, because you have the British at war with France. France, of course, was an integral part of the order. You get the British Navy just outside the Maltese harbour, attacking any French ship that dares to approach the island, or that dares to go to attempt to leave harbour in Malta, and that got the order into a very difficult situation. Anyhow, Dodsworth wasn't exactly the person to help in the situation. Eventually you had a whole row, and eventually, the British government recalled Dodsworth. What's also interesting is that Dodsworth also got in trouble with the local Inquisition, because he was reported as having a library of English books, some of which were apparently suspect. Now, one has to keep in mind that in a society like Malta in the 18th century, where practically no one knew English, you had this issue, any book in English was suspect, was guilty until proven innocent. Okay? So having a collection of English language books would have, and we have this list of Dodsworth's books, which has been preserved in the archive of the Inquisition. Okay? Suspect, indeed, many of them were now prohibited and listed in the index. This is a classic. I mean, this is, one of the great works. A letter concerning toleration, humbly submitted. John Locke. First edition. London, 1689. It is preserved in a bound pamphlet with other less important publications. And when you open the cover of this bound volume, you get that note, an 18th century hand that wasn't written yesterday. These most incomparable letters upon toleration are very scarce, they said in the 18th century, to be met with. that is separate from the folio edition of Locke's work. So as an individual book, this first edition is very, very scarce. That's the 18th century. Imagine today, okay? First edition, John Locke in English, available in this collection. Okay, we're passing towards the end now. Now, more specifically, not French literature, not sort of international literature, but books which directly related to the order, which are available in this collection and which were definitely prohibited. One of the early histories of the order in Latin, Militaris, Johannitorum, Rhodium, Melitensium, Equitum, these never-ending titles, a huge book, Basel, 1581. It was considered, and actually it was in that case, written from a Protestant perspective, the history of the order from a non-Catholic perspective, so you get a lot of criticism against Rome, popes, what have you. Certainly not officially sanctioned. This wasn't a book that the order commissioned from Pantaleon, who was the author, but he wrote it out of his own volition, and the order obviously disassociated itself from it, and the book ended up on the index of prohibited books. Why? Because essentially it is attacking Rome. Another case, a Spanish author, Escano, who publishes this rather pedantic Propugnaculum Hierosolmitanum. Essentially, we're talking about an interpretation of the rules, the regulations, the statutes of the order. Okay? A reason for condemnation in this case, 1664 Seville, because the interpretation as given does not tally with that which is officially sanctioned by Rome. So the book is out. It was an interpretation which favored the order in the sense that it was pro-order, it gave more leeway to the order. You have to remember that the order was a Catholic order. So the ultimate head of the order wasn't the Grand Master, it was the Pope. The Pope technically could remove a Grand Master. This book is saying, easy, the order is a sovereign order, so, even the Pope should limit his. There is an interesting continuation regarding this book. When printing was established in Malta, permanently, 1756, by Pinto, one of the first books that Pinto wanted to be printed was actually a new edition of this book. This had been printed 1664, almost a century before, out of print, obviously. And the Grand Master said, it's about time that we have a reissue. Now, you have to keep in mind that in Malta, printing was censored by 3 different authorities, by the government, Grand Master, by the Bishop of Malta, and by the Inquisitor. Usually, Bishop usually towed the line of the Inquisitor. The Inquisitor was the real, power. When the Inquisitor got to know, because they had to submit the request before, the Inquisitor said, no way, you are going to reprint that, because we have serious reservations about the interpretation in that book. And Pinto had to give up. And the Maltese edition never came out. So we only have this, which is as well, a copy of it is here. Okay, perhaps most famous is Vertot. Vertot is different in the sense that Vertot was officially commissioned by the order. So the order appointed Vertot, who was already an important, a renowned French historian. Listen, we want our history written by a professional. Okay, we will pay you. They gave him the cross of the order, they heaped honors upon him. Vertot said, okay, no problem, I will write you a history of the order. Finally, in 1726, this book comes out in 2 versions, actually, in an octavo and a quarto one. 1726, When this book comes to Malta, all hell breaks loose. The Inquisitor, even the order, they said, my goodness, the attacks on past popes. That pope was corrupt, that pope did so many things, they worked against the order, but even their private life, my goodness, there's no way that the order can accept this as an official history, and they disassociate itself totally. And in fact, Verto ended on the index. So Verto was formally condemned by the church and finished on. You have a huge number of editions of Verto, because, it's 18th century now, people want to read it. Lots of editions, Amsterdam, Neuchâtel, you name it, loads of them. You also have an English edition, of course, something like this would delight the English, my goodness. Wow, a book against the church, published by the order, we will definitely translate this into English and publish it. And you have the version which most of us are more familiar with. Okay. A much lesser known book, but extremely interesting. What is the background of this book? Rogadeo was a Neapolitan lawyer. He was asked to come to Malta by the Grand Master, the Rohan, because the Rohan wanted to reform the entire legal system of Malta, the way our courts worked, and he also wanted to issue a new code of laws. The code of laws was from Valletta. If you sang in the street, you are likely to be executed, so the Rohan said it's about time that we sort of modernize. And, Maltese governments like to do this. They get a foreign expert. And in this case, the foreign expert was Gian Donato Rogadeo, a Neapolitan. He was employed, he started his work, but apparently the Maltese legal profession ganged up on him and made his life apparently worse than hell. Eventually, he gave up. He tore his whatever, and he left Malta. And the work was continued by the Maltese lawyers, the uditori. The uditori were the Maltese. The uditori were the most powerful Maltese. The uditori were the personal advisors, personal secretaries of the Grand Master. And they wielded great power. He went back to his country, fuming and raging, but he didn't stop there. He published this book. I mean, this is a book which I think should be translated in English. I don't know in Maltese, but in English. I mean, close to 500 pages, attacking anything related to Malta. Anything. The Maltese character. Maltese donkeys are more savage than donkeys. Everything. My God, it is. I mean, Judge Giovanni Bonello wrote a short study on this book. It's in one of his Histories of Malta, Volume 1, I think. It's incredible, this book. The onslaught and on the Maltese legal class, my goodness. I mean, this is just, a very, and not the word, this is not the worst comment. When it comes to making a profit, there is no justice, no humanity, no religion that will induce a Maltese to do what is right. The most wicked of them have always become jealous. I mean, this is, awful, my goodness. We are bad, hopefully not. Perhaps our ancestors were like that, we have hopefully mellowed with time. Two editions have come out. Lucca 1780, extremely rare. This is not the first edition actually. Extremely rare, 1780. Then the Naples edition, 1783. What happened? So, printed in Naples, printed in Lucca, not in Malta, but obviously copies would come to Malta. All hell breaks loose. I mean, he is slandering the most powerful Maltese persons. These are the persons, Gian Nicola Muscat, these persons who are, at the core of the administration in Malta. And the Grand Master issues his edict of prohibition. I will translate his Su Altezza, the Grand Master, Padrone, Sovereign Lord, for his just reasons, he doesn't need to give you the reasons, for his just reasons, orders, commands, and wishes that anyone who has a copy of this book entitled Ragionamenti di Cavaleggio nel Rogadeo, within 24 hours has to take the book to the Court of Law, the Gran Corte della Castellania, Merchant Street, which now is the Ministry of Health, the Castellania. Within 24 hours, so that the Grand Master's wishes are satisfied under the penalties that he might decide. The penalties hadn't been specified yet, but there would be penalties if you are caught with that book after the 24 hours. Okay, so in this case, again, the church has absolutely nothing to do with this case. It is the government that is expressly prohibiting. Of course, the Maltese didn't stay quiet, with their hands wrapped around their chest. And you have no less than 3 books by 3 Maltese that are rebutting, attacking Rogadeo. Prospectus by Micallef, these were all uditori, these were all people, who were really slandered by Rogadeo. Lettera di un Maltese ad un cavaliere Gerson Professor, sort of, I am writing you this letter to clarify what this Rogadeo said about us. We also know the author there, a certain Pisani. You may notice all of them not printed in Malta, because apparently the Grand Master didn't want to listen. That book is prohibited, that book is as if it doesn't exist. I don't want the controversy to remain. If you are going to print, you will not print them on the island. And the third one, Gian Nicola Muscat, a very important, colorful character, Apologia a favore, this is perhaps the most dramatic title of them all. Apologia a favore dell'Inclita Nazione Maltese, suoi tribunali, the Court of Law, Segnatura, elegisti. Segnatura was the core of administration, sort of. Contro il libello famoso intitolato Ragionamenti di Rogadeo. So, 3 books, 3 Maltese, 3 of those who Rogadeo really attacked, coming out against this